So my goal for you today is to understand what that law says and also to use it to make valid conclusions. In class, I started with more practice with the conditional, converse, inverse, contrapositive, and biconditional. I recommend that you practice these if-then statements and being able to write them and being able to evaluate their truth. Know that the biconditional has an if and only if with it, that conditional goes P, then S in this case. So if I were going to write that, I would write the angles are vertical. If the angles are vertical, then they are congruent. The truth value for that is true. Vertical angles are congruent. The converse is if we flap them around. If the angles are congruent, then they are vertical. This is false because I can come up with a counterexample. I just need two angles that are congruent. So let's say this angle is 60 degrees, but they don't form an X. So those two angles are not vertical angles, but they are congruent. So that is a counterexample. The inverse is when I make both statements not, but I keep them in the original order. So the angles are not vertical. If the angles are not vertical, then they are not congruent, and this would be false, and that counterexample from above works for that one. Converse and inverse have the same truth value. Contrapositive is when I do the most, I swap them around. If the angles are not congruent and I make them not, then they are not vertical, and the conditional and the contrapositive have the same truth value. The biconditional is when I connect my two statements with an if and only if, which I can read forwards and backwards and still be true. So the biconditional would be the angles are vertical angles if and only if they are congruent. And because the converse and the inverse are false, the biconditional is false. And I can use the same counterexample for that biconditional. Remember, a biconditional, if it sounds good, make sure you read it the other way to be 100% certain that it's not good. Okay, Law of Syllogism is new this section. The Law of Syllogism, I think of it as dominoes falling down. One thing leads to another. So for Law of Syllogism, you are given two conditional statements. You'd be given if A, then B. Your second given statement would start with if B, then C. I want to really highlight that your conclusion for your first statement, your conclusion for your first statement and your hypothesis for the second statement need to match. The conclusion you can make given that information is you can skip the middle part and jump right from the beginning to the end. You knocked over the first domino and it knocked over some other dominoes, but what happened in the end is that the last domino fell over. So your conclusion is also an if-then statement, but we skip over the middle part. Okay. So we're going to write a conclusion here. If I pass the test, so A, then I get an A in geometry. If I get an A in geometry, then I get a new car. I pass the test is A, so I get a new car. Ryan knows that if he misses a day, practice the day before the game, then he will not start in the game. If Ryan doesn't start in the game, then he will not be able to be team captain. Ryan misses practice on Tuesday, so he will not start. He will not be team captain. on Wednesday. So we go from A, we jump over B, and we go right to C. We go to the last domino that falls down. Okay. For these ones, I want you to write an if-then conclusion, if it's possible. If it's not possible, I want you to write no valid conclusion. It might be helpful to use your highlighter to indicate the sequence. So a quadrilateral is a square, then it has 4 right angles. If a quadrilateral has 4 right angles, then it is a rectangle. My conclusion can go right from A to C. So I went A to B, I went B to C. My conclusion can be if a quadrilateral is a square, then it is a rectangle. And just to highlight that, I'm going straight from the yellow to the orange, and I'm not stopping at blue. Okay, if you understand the law of syllogism, you will do well on the test. If you do well on the test, you will pass the class. So the conclusion, if you understand the law of syllogism, then you will pass the class. I'm only trying to make a logical argument. It doesn't have to be a correct argument. If a number ends in 0, then it is divisible by 10. A number ends in 0. Then it is divisible by 10. If a number ends in 5, oh, that's going to be a different color. If a number ends in 5, then it is divisible by 5. Oh, that's going to be still a different color. So all of these are different colors, which means I don't have a valid conclusion. I can't skip over anything because we don't have dominoes that are pushing each other over. So this is no conclusion. Okay, there's some practice at the end where I'm asking you to label the law of detachment, law of syllogism, or not valid. So I'm going to have you pause here and try that without me, and then come back after you've given it a try.